Good evening and welcome to this event hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. I'm Brendan Sims, Director of the Centre. Today, we're discussing the war at sea, during which the Allies first stemmed the Axis tide and then turned it. This has long been recognised as a central aspect of the Second World War. But was it decided by traditional large-scale fleet engagements, as some claim, or by a steady process of attrition, as others argue? How important was peacetime preparation as compared to wartime mobilisation and innovation? What is the legacy of the war at sea and its principal engagements today? Did the contribution of individuals matter in an age of mass production? Now, this evening, we're delighted to be joined by the authors of two new books on the subject: the distinguished naval and international historian, Paul Kennedy, and the US Army veteran and my co-author, Steve McGregor. Paul Kennedy is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History and Director of International Security Studies at Yale University, and Distinguished Fellow of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. He obtained his BA at Newcastle University and his DPhil at the University of Oxford. He holds many honorary degrees and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Paul is internationally known for his writings and commentaries on global, political, economic, and strategic issues, including, of course, his best-known work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. But he's now just published Victory at Sea, Naval Power, and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II. Our other panelist, Steve McGregor, is a US Army veteran. He was deployed to the sunny Triangle of Death as an infantry officer in the 101st Airborne Division. There he earned the Combat Infantryman's Badge and the Purple Heart. After his military service, he moved to England and completed a graduate degree in history from Cambridge University. He is the co-author, with myself, Brendan Sims, of Silver Waterfall: How America Won the Pacific War at Midway. So now, let's move into our remarks from the two of you. I think the two books complement each other very nicely. We've got this sort of wide angle vision from Paul, and we've got a very detailed description of a particular event, but embedded in a wider story. So Paul, can you kick us off and tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book, why you wrote the book, and I guess also a question many people will be asking of both books, which is, what is there new to say about the war at sea and individual battles?
Yes, thank you. The Victory at Sea book that I wrote was, you will notice, there's a sort of co-author there, which is Ian Marshall, the great marine painter. And it was partly to give some overall text to the wonderful paintings of Ian Marshall, who'd done a whole number of ones on warships of the Second World War, not just British and American, but German, Japanese, and Italian. Could you put that in a format which would illustrate best his paintings and give it a overall history of the war at sea once again? So it starts off with a little attempt to rescue these wonderful paintings. Over time, as I write this book, and unfortunately, Ian passes away of a heart attack halfway through our enterprise, I begin to wonder if one cannot do it as another, as a more interesting look at why the war turned in 1943, 42, 43, and what was behind the immense productive surge of the Allied navies and air forces to give a backdrop to air power. So Brendan, the idea that these two books complement each other is absolutely right. One is looking at a particular battle in which it turns in the war at sea. The other one, while illustrative of a bigger story, is trying to set also the underpinning economic structures and productive structures which are going to lead to the victory of the Allies in the long term. Therefore, there's something of a tension in my book. It's it's a I hope a fairly exciting narrative of what happens in the the convoy battles in Malta or up to the North Cape, the battle back and forth in the Atlantic, then what happens in the Pacific. But I do want to use one of the chapters just to take time off in chapter 8 and look at the productive forces which lead to the underlying shifts in world affairs. On the other hand, and this is why I think our discussion will be so interesting, we have to leave time for individual leaders, individual political, particular weapon systems which come out of the genius of a certain person designing the Spitfire, or designing the flat bottom boat for amphibious landings, and also the decisiveness of some of the victories at sea, which are ding-dong battles, as indeed Midway turns out to be. So I think I will stop there and allow that lead into Evan, please.
Thank you very much. And the book is indeed extremely exciting. I actually read it while I was on holiday in Malta. So Operation Pedestal formed the perfect backdrop.
Oh, wow.
So I can only recommend it to anybody who's going on a long journey. It's the absolute optimum accompaniment. But Steve, inevitable question also to you. What is there new to say about the Battle of Midway, a topic which has been much studied, indeed much filmed?
Yes, it's a worthy question, and it is. I agree with Paul. I think that these books do work very well together, because with Paul's you do see the war in its totality, and also all the different theaters. So you see the Mediterranean war in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, and the Pacific. But with our book, with the Battle of Midway, we're looking at one battle in particular. This one battle, which primarily takes place on the 4th of June, 1942, 6 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And this battle, I mean, it's the most important battle in U.S. naval history. So it's essential for military historians certainly, but even historians more broadly, to understand the Second World War. This battle is very important for many different reasons. In terms of what's new in our book, I think with our book we focus on three key individuals, which really their story has not been told yet. And these three individuals: Ed Heinemann, he's the designer of the American dive bomber, the Dauntless, which allows the Americans to win the Battle of Midway. We then look at Chester Nimitz, the strategist who puts the American fleet in the right place at the right time to fight the Japanese. But then we conclude by looking at Dusty Kleiss, the pilot, one of the pilots in the battle on the day, piloting Ed Heinemann's plane. And so by looking at these three individuals, we bring out some themes. One thing is that it's a migration story. The American victory at Midway is a migration story, because all three of these key participants are the descendants of German immigrants to the U.S. So this migration story aspect is very new. It's something that hasn't been looked at before with the battle. And also Ed Heinemann himself, the designer of the Dauntless, he has yet to really receive his due credit for the American victory. And there's a lot of things about his influence, which I'm sure we'll get into later in terms of the overall scope of the war. And so just our approach to the battle is unique. And it allows us to also then look at the legacy of the battle, because now the Battle of Midway is passing into history, and it's become something that we can kind of see from a distance. And this is a unique time to think of the battle, because previously it's been written within the lifetimes of participants, and when the battle is much more of a recent event than it is today.
Thank you very much. Now, both books, as we've just heard, look not just at the Second World War, but also at the prehistory. And the first question I want to ask concerns conceptions and expectations of war. Paul, you looked at the build-up to war, how the war at sea was being imagined before it actually happened, how the great powers were preparing for it in terms of training and building and so on. To what extent did the war that then actually took place match those expectations?
All of the planning staffs of all of the services of all of the great powers in the 1930s are trying to figure out what will this next war be and how different will it be from and how similar to the only big war you know in your memory, which is the First World War. So admirals and admiralty planners are no exception here. And they are also scratching their head not only about whether you can have another future war at sea, which is the battleship war, and therefore build up them, but what do you do with these newfangled things called aircraft and aircraft carriers, not to mention submarines and torpedoes and what intelligence systems and if you like, if you knew about it, code breakers and code breaking. So all of this is a tumult of considerations by the planning staffs about what will the next war at sea look like. And it's not surprising to me, Brendan, but hardly anybody gets it right. The British don't get it right on two great sort of expectations, because they expected that France, their big ally, would stay in the war. When France falls in 1940, you have to rethink the geopolitics of the war at sea. And they have no idea that Dönitz, the dynamic leader of the U-boats, is going to have his essentially the U-boats attack on the surface most of the time, rather underwater where you can detect them. As to the war in the Pacific, most of the American admirals, like their Japanese counterparts, are battleship admirals. They're looking to have a more successful Jutland fight somewhere in the Central Pacific. And therefore, the knocking out of almost all of your battleships at Pearl Harbor really causes a destruction of the pre-war planning and assumptions. And you have to work from scratch, but thank heaven, you have the aircraft carriers not involved in Pearl Harbor and able to be the beginnings of a counteroffensive.
Steve, how does this pan out for your story? Do you agree that the emphasis on battleships is something that doesn't then materialize?
Yes, I completely agree. I think that is a huge shift in strategy. And fortunately, the Americans in the Pacific recognized this relatively early on with Chester Nimitz when he comes in to take command of the Pacific Fleet. And soon after, he arrives on Christmas Day in 1941. And he is one of these early adopters of the importance of air power. You see that earlier in his career. And that is definitely a big change. I think another big change, so there's that change in technology. I think that air power is a huge shift. I think another big change is the Japanese, they expand so rapidly. So within 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they've moved out very quickly. They now have captured Malaysia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong. You know, they've acquired an immense amount of territory in a small period of time, and that's something that I think did shock Americans and the American war planners. They thought that at least the Philippines would be a kind of holdout, and so you begin to see. I think the relevance here is it then means that to go on the offensive, it's a much greater risk for the Americans, and that's a risk that Chester Nimitz is willing to take. We go through that in the book, but that's an important change. I think from the Japanese perspective, what's interesting is that they in their war games in the 1930s, Admiral Ginda goes into this. The Japanese are expecting that they will be an underdog against the US. So they're planning to fight America in the 1930s. But what's funny is that by 1941, the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, is actually very strong. I mean, it's stronger in some respects than the Americans. There's definitely some weaknesses as well, but it's difficult to really say. And to a large degree, there's parity or strength from the Japanese side. So even their plans are a bit of a surprise because they're thinking they're going to come in as an underdog, but in reality, it doesn't quite play out that way. So I think both sides, the expectations don't quite match reality.
Now, you both mentioned the importance of technology, and this prompts me to ask whether the development of technology is more important during the war or before the war, because we have a kind of an image, I think, certainly in the UK, of a Second World War which is fought badly and with poor equipment in the first few years under the professionals, and that then you have mass mobilization and amateur genius, which saves the day. Paul, is that a picture that you would recognize for the war at sea?
Oh, no, I wouldn't. I think what strikes me again and again is how much these often much derided admiralties I have well prepared in having a scientific establishment and being able to contact the major physics and chemistry departments of the UK and the US, of being able to think through the potential of what's going to be newer technologies. Look at the very swift development of radar, not only land radar to help you detect the oncoming German Luftwaffe at the Battle of Britain, but a miniaturized sea radar. Look at the ways in which you're beginning to try to detect enemy forces underwater as well as in the surface and on the air. Look at the way the Americans are beginning to develop fused shells, homing torpedoes. I think the story is very much one of a Boffin's war, which the Boffins win as they get more resources during the war. But much of this has been quite well thought out before the war itself, with a rather good scientific and infrastructure backup.
That's interesting what you say about the role of the universities. They must have, in current parlance, have had an impact factor to die for.
They have a product. Everybody's now asking universities for what your product is. In the Second World War, you could, unless it was top secret, you could clearly say what your product is, but Prime Minister, we have discovered, just a couple of postdocs, we discovered how to miniaturize radar so we'll be able to detect German submarines on the surface. My goodness.
Steve, in terms of the Battle of Midway, what's the balance there between technological development during the war and what had been done beforehand?
Yes, I think this is a really interesting question, mainly because all of the resources that go into the fight at Midway, so the planes themselves, the pilots who fly them, even the ships that bring them there, this is all developed before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So you could say, in many respects, you could say this battle, it comes about because of the peacetime Navy. So there's definitely a sense in which Ed Heinemann develops the Dauntless. He develops it. He starts drawing it in 1934. So this is well before the U.S. enters the war, or is even thinking of being in a military posture. So I think the plane, the Dauntless, shows the way the peacetime Navy plays an important role. But then also, if you think about the pilot, one of the pilot we focus on the most, Dusty Kleiss, he enters the Naval Academy in 1934. So he begins his naval career the same year that Ed Heinemann starts designing the plane he eventually flies. And this is a time when America is at peace.
So again and again, Brendan, one says this wonderful weapon or this wonderful leadership or this wonderful construct. And then you say, when did it first start? When are you putting the Merlin engine together? When are you designing the wings of the submarine Spitfire? When are you thinking of successful design of a powerful dive bomber? When is Pratt & Whitney going to develop its very, very powerful engine? And 9 times out of 10, I would think you're going back to something which happens about 1935, 1936, 1934, which takes a number of years to get to fruition, but fruition is there when you need it by 1942 and onwards.
In fact, Paul, you make that point in one of your essays at the end of the book. You talk about the causal chain, which begins with a mine to find aluminum, and how that leads to victory in war. So I think this definitely comes out when you start to look at the detail of how the end result comes about. You start to see the way it has an origin which lays much further back in history.
We're now very, very obsessed about product change, Brendan, and how they are being disrupted by something which is happening on the other side of the Pacific. But product change are things which every modern manager, every modern sort of factory, including aircraft factories and aircraft engine factories, know about. So indeed, Steve, I had a lot of fun a bit to the derision of my family, creating this like balloon chain or sausage chain of, if you start with the Bauxite Mountain in Dutch Suriname and go stage and stage through it, you end up with the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which is going to take place a little after Midway, but has some similarities to it. Yeah, and you have these superbly effective, powerful engine-driven new planes backed up by detective systems of decryption on the one hand and radar on the other. And you say, where do they come from and who created them? And this is an essential part of understanding why the victory goes to this side. And your look at the players behind the Midway victory is just as important a story as the larger one I try to tell in Victory at Sea.
Yeah, I think with Midway, it comes out in terms of these kind of chance occurrences in people's lives, often with after a lot of hard work has been put in. So Ed Heinemann never goes to university. He leaves school at 17. His dream is to design aircraft. And when he goes up to interview at Douglas Aircraft, the gentleman there, he hires him. He looks at Heinemann's drawings and he thinks, I'm gonna bet on this guy. I'm gonna give him a job. And so it's, in a way, you could say that sort of willingness to take a chance, because he sees Heinemann's work, he sees his drive, he realizes this guy is going to perform, that he wants this job, he's hungry. That is what then leads to Heinemann being able to design this plane that allows America to accomplish victory years later, when they're involved in a war that no one in a battle, certainly a battle that no one had predicted.
We're going quite far back now, and rightly so, into supply chains and development chains, as it were, from project to completion, which makes me wonder about the balance between, the drama and the longue durée, the attrition, and the actual clashes of fleets. Now, Paul, you've got both, if you like, the wider framing about productive forces and statistics, but you also have quite a lot of really just gripping, I guess, accounts of, I mentioned Operation Pedestal, convoys to Malta, but also obviously the Scandinavian campaign, the Norway campaign, which had a very strong naval dimension. But to what extent is that actually just, decoration? I mean, how important are individual engagements in this story? Is it not just more a matter of attrition than of decisive battles, in your view?
No, it isn't. There is the underlying forces. There's the underlying geographical situation. There are a number of big factors in history we can point to, Brendan, and there are some battles which turn to be more decisive, viewed retrospectively, than others. Mm-hmm. But there is place in our story, both in the Pacific War and in the Atlantic War, for seeing the individual in action, mm-hmm. An individual weapon system in action, and and also being rather suspicious of the argument sometimes put that if it hadn't happened in this battle, if it hadn't happened here and there, it would have happened just a bit later because the great economic odds are on one side or the other. If there hadn't been the Battle of Midway, go and figure the end of that, then there still was going to be a sufficient American product of new aircraft carriers and cruisers and battleships to be decisive. If it hadn't been the loss of this convoy, then another convoy would come. I'd like to resist that argument. I think there is a place in this story, as there should be, for how the individual battle does turn significantly the outcome of very important campaigns in the Atlantic and in the Pacific.
Steve, how does Midway fit into this story that Paul's describing?
Yeah, I think it does play. It plays an important part, and there is debate about this. So Richard Frank, in his book on Guadalcanal, definitely places a lot of emphasis on that battle and claims that this battle, Guadalcanal, takes place later in 1942, moving into 1943. It's a months-long battle where over 2,000 Japanese airmen are killed. There's a lot of bloodshed on both sides, and this is really Frank argues this is the turning point. What's important in the Pacific campaign, but what's important for the Battle of Midway, and the reason why this battle is so crucial to the way the Pacific War turns out is, you get this sense if you read something like James Jones's memoir of the Pacific War. He is on Pearl Harbor when it's attacked in December of 41. And he says that it's a huge psychological blow to go through that 6-month period where the Japanese are just on the rampage, expanding, taking more and more territory. And so Midway is this first time when the Americans really feel they have a decisive victory and that this is a war that they can win. So I think there you really it's important to see the psychological impact of the American victory. And then I think just in terms of how the American offensive works in the Pacific, it's really the victory at Midway that allows the battle at Guadalcanal to take place. And Parshall and Tully make this point at the end of their book, Shattered Sword, where they argue that it's really that victory at Midway that allows American planners to start looking ahead and saying, yeah, we can continue to move forward and try and take some ground back from the Japanese.
So here's a big methodological question for you, Brendan, and for anybody else who's looking in or listening in. Whenever you come across a work which says, my book shows this is the turning point, whether it's the turning point of the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, or the turning point of Stalingrad, or the turning point of a convoy in the Atlantic, or the turning point of a war in the Pacific, it seems to me that it is incumbent upon the author of that statement, it's incumbent upon the historian who says that, to spend time showing how it is the turning point, not just making the claim and then walking away with that claim, but showing that when the Battle of Britain is won, that gives the British the breathing point to do this, and this. Therefore, it is a turning point. So I think that if you can do the same thing with the Great Battle of Midway, if you can say what is consequential on the Japanese side and the American side in the remainder of 1942 into 1943, which wouldn't have happened if the Japanese had won the Battle of Midway, then you're on a stronger argumentative point that this is something that is important and decisive.
Well, Steve, Paul has put it up to us, but specifically to you. You've already mentioned how Guadalcanal could not have happened. What about, say, the impact on the Germany First strategy and the wider direction of the war? Do you think Midway might have made a difference there, or? It
definitely, well, it allows America to continue its Germany First strategy, and there's a lot of different ways that then impacts the war. So you could argue that if we hadn't won Midway, maybe we would have had to think about using nukes in Europe, because we would have had difficulty moving in and getting into Europe and moving, isolating Germany and the campaign there, staging the landings and getting a foothold there in the continent. I think, I can take a page from Victory at Sea, because in that book, Paul, you talk about how the nature of the Pacific naval campaign, it changes after Midway. The Japanese, because of their decrease in air power after the Battle of Midway, it causes them to have to fight defensively, and so the warfare that you see in the Pacific at sea. It's no longer this strong opposition between these offensive forces with air power. It's now the U.S. with air power, and the Japanese that have to remain focused on their surface fleet. So I think you then see the way the Pacific campaign itself changes character, and that's less of a kind of speculative point to make about how history might have played out if things went a different way at Midway.
Now, you've both spoken quite a bit about equipment, about balance of production. What about the human factor? That is to say, morale, which is obviously a huge aspect of the war in Europe on land. If you think, for instance, of say the French campaign, does that play a role in the war at sea? Paul, do you want to lead on this?
I think it does very decisively. Here's morale and morale building, which we pay little attention to, but the way in which Dönitz thought of his submarine commanders as a band of brothers, that he went to greet their submarine when it would come in from a successful raiding voyage. He would be there with a photograph. He'd be sending messages to Adolf Hitler. He would be encouraging this, what the French call corps d'esprit, the idea that you are part of this key group of fighters who can do it. And so, yes, morale counts in the case of the German U-boat fleet. The flip side of that is the German surface fleet, rather depressed because it stays in harbor. It gets bombed by the British. It rarely goes to sea. When it goes to sea, the Graf Spee, then the Bismarck, etc., are sunk. So morale plays a depressing effect there, I would guess. On the British side, you had a great deal of morale, a positive morale in the interwar Royal Navy, whether it was the new aircraft carrier groupings on the one hand, with the destroyers and light cruisers. I think a great deal of leadership and conviction that you're going to win, great deal of courage, no sense of defeatism. You began your remark, Brendan, by talking about the French campaign of 1940. It's quite clear from the record that a large amount of France, in political terms, and in the military leadership, might have felt that this was a war they were not going to win. That doesn't happen, and so many of the Allied forces, whether it's on land or sea, about ultimately the victory is ours, but we have to go out and fight and win it.
Steve, it was often said, at least in an earlier generation of historians of Midway, that the Americans had no right to win, and that it was sort of a victory of superior spirit, but also of luck and good fortune. How do you see the role of morale in your story?
I think morale it's vital, and I think especially now it's hard because I've been reading in the press. There's a lot of stuff now about U.S. naval ships accidents at sea and morale, sailors. There's problems with suicide in some units, and yeah, it's sad. I mean, in the Army as well, there's issues with this because I mean, morale is essential to victory. I mean, men's hearts have to be they have to want to win in order to I mean, in these battles, especially at something like Midway, where you have strong navies on either side, you have to want to win in order to win that fight. I think you see it definitely with Dusty Kleist, this pilot who we focus on in the book. A fair amount of his story is a love story, actually, between him and his girlfriend at the time. They elope after he gets back, but he writes to her on the eve of battle. He writes to her this long love letter, this 2-page letter where he says, "Give me courage." That's what he asks her for. He says, "Give me courage." And so you see that how vital this connection is between the home front and the battlefront, and the way he needs to believe in what he's doing. I mean, I think he does believe in what he's doing, and this is something he does, a job that he has been trained to do, and a job that he wins. It's a battle that he wins with his skill and his determination.
Now, I've got many more questions, but I'm going to pause them for a moment because we've got queries coming in from the audience, and there's one from Chris Weston, and I'm going to start with Steve on this one. He asked, do the authors believe that their respective histories have pertinence for US naval power in the Indo-Pacific region of today? And he references particularly the PRC's anti-access, area denial, and anti-carrier ballistic missiles, but you may both want to answer more broadly. So Steve, how do you think your story, what do you think the legacy or the implications of your story is for what Chris is asking about?
I think two things. So one is that is the geography. So the geography is the same. The geography of the Pacific War, it matches up completely with the current challenge that the U.S. and you could say even the West more generally is facing in the Pacific. And the reason that's important is because you see, when you're looking at the Pacific War, you understand it's an enormous, absolutely enormous territory. The Pacific, it's like 3 times larger than the European theater was. And this means you need a wide range of ships in order to fight effectively there. You also need to be very good at amphibious operations. That has to be something you can do well. So there's all kinds of tactical things that come from that, from the terrain itself, and also just the need for alliances. So the geography kind of is very essential to look at. You're no longer just looking at sort of 1 or 2 players or a handful of players. It's a wide number of players, and you have this island geography, because Midway, the whole reason why they're fighting over Midway is it's like an insignificant size of land out there, but it's still large enough for air power, for airplanes to make use of. And it's a gateway. It's a gateway, this tiny island in the middle of the ocean. It's a gateway to Hawaii, which isn't a gateway to the continent, to the continental US. So I think geography is important. And I would say then something from our book is you get a sense of how leadership plays such an important role in the outcome of a contest. So we need strong leaders who are able to take a broad view and to size up a challenge. I mean, Nimitz had been out in the Pacific since his earliest days as a young officer in the Navy. He goes out there on the Ohio right after graduation from the Naval Academy. So this is like in 1905. He graduates in 1905. So yeah, I'd say geography and leadership, 2 very important things.
Paul.
So here's a prediction for you two co-authors of the book on Midway. My prediction would be that either legally or illegally, there will very rapidly be a Chinese language translation of this book, because the Chinese today, comes back to Brendan's question, the Chinese today take seriously the study of history, and of the history of technology, and the history of previous battles. I scratch my head occasionally, Brendan, when I get every 6 months the details of the Chinese language sales, commercial sales, that is, of my much earlier book, The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery. Mm-hmm. And I ask, well, what are the Chinese doing buying so many copies of British Naval Mastery? And of course, there's nothing to do, I think, with that British story, except they wish to say, as a rising naval power, which comes back to your question, who is going to expand outwards from our Chinese shores, what sort of lessons are there about naval strategy, geography, sustainability, and maybe the invention of newer weapons of war, which will take by surprise the prevailing #1 Navy? What lessons are there that we can draw? So I think they will be looking at the Battle of Midway and what is technology, what is leadership, what is strategic control, what has intelligence got to do, which might help us as a rising naval power?
Well, you're absolutely right. They are studying it. And we know that we do cite a number of cases in the final chapter of the book, analyses of the battle, trying to learn from the Japanese mistakes. And to answer your question, there is in fact a legal edition of the book in mainland Chinese, or at least the form of Chinese they use there. And there's one in negotiation for Taiwan.
Okay.
So plainly, Chris Weston, there is interest both in our book and of course, in Paul Kennedy's books there, and they are drawing conclusions. Now, there's another question which takes us back into the Second World War from David Coleman, and this is specifically for Paul. And it's about small-scale carrier operations in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So first of all, he wants to know more about the fate of the Courageous and the Glorious. Was it as bad as Aboukir, Cressy, and the Hogue? But also on the carriers, he asks, I do not think there was any offensive action by more than one British carrier in those sectors. Was it just a lack of targets and ships? Even Taranto involved just one carrier. even though 2 were planned. I think there might have been 2 in the Mediterranean at some point, but I'll let you respond on this.
The Royal Navy gets into this Second World War with a notion that carriers and carrier warfare is important. However, it has different views about how you use the carriers. Winston Churchill, who comes in as First Lord once again, wants to send aggressively carriers into the Atlantic and elsewhere to search for German submarines, which is, of course, a misuse tactically and operationally of what carriers are about. The Courageous is sunk by a U-boat early in the war, which is quite a blow because it's one of the better of the few existing Royal Navy carriers at the time. So right through this war, this is the big answer to David Coleman, right through the war, the US Navy, the British Navy, I beg your pardon, had to operate on a shoestring, as it were, of limited number of carriers. Mainly there could be one carrier with the home fleet. Maybe there could be the famous Ark Royal as a carrier with Force H operating out of Gibraltar. Maybe you could have just a single carrier to implement that decisive nighttime strike at Taranto. So yes, indeed, the question, the counterfactual is, what would have happened if the British had a cluster of 3 or 4 or 5 fast, effective carriers at hand in the early parts of the war, rather than just very late on in the war when they can send a big carrier fleet, relatively speaking, to the Far East. But by that time, the US has 4 or 5 or 6 times as many aircraft carriers as the British.
Do you think if as had been planned at one point, a carrier had been sent out to escort the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, which of course were sunk early in the war in the Far East, do you think that would have made a difference? Or do you think those carriers the British carriers were simply too small in terms of the volume of aircraft they could field?
No, Brendan, the carrier which was planned to be attached to Prince of Wales and the Repulse in the Far East was going to be one of a modern illustrious class or victorious class carriers, which would have a pretty advanced radar detection system on it, would have a lot of carrier air patrol experience because they'd be practicing all the way as they went to the Far East. It could well have protected the British big ships against these incredibly effective attacks by land-based but Japanese naval aircraft. If Force H had survived then, with a carrier attached to it after these strikes, I think they might have pulled back from the plans of the invasion of southern Thailand and certainly from Malaya, Singapore, and the southern operation theater might have gone in a different direction. So I'm willing to contemplate the fact that the lack of that carrier could have been a really decisive element in the destruction of Force C.
Steve, I mean, there's a similar thing really that happens to the Japanese at Midway, isn't there? I mean, they're missing 2 of the carriers they might otherwise have had.
Yeah, the Zuikaku and Shokaku, because of Coral Sea. I mean, and not necessarily because carriers themselves are damaged, because the air groups, they have this thing about matching air groups to carriers. I think it is an interesting shift because it can make the presence of a carrier can make a huge difference. And I guess you still get this today. Carriers are used to show national interest in a conflict or a region, and they can send a huge signal. And definitely, if the Japanese, I mean, they even had a light carrier with another group that was based with the landing force for Midway. I mean, one of the issues with some of the Japanese operations, they're so complex. They've got ships everywhere, rendezvousing at different points, and so there's a light carrier down there with the landing force, which is too far away from the striking fleet from Kido Butai to help them. So they could have grouped them, more in play or group them together. There is a dispersion there, which does lead to a problem. But I guess the Americans use their carriers in a dispersed way, and that helps. There's advantages to that as well. So yeah, it can make a big difference where they're placed.
So, listening to both of you, a critic might say, well, this is a lot of talk about ships, about individuals, about production. Isn't this, the way naval history was being written 60, 70 years ago? Paul, I mean, you've been writing naval history for quite a while. How do you think the field itself has changed? I mean, how, in terms of how you write naval history and how others are writing it, is it simply just an improved gradual accretion of knowledge over time, or are we doing things differently in some fundamental way, do you think?
So the critic would be on the whole quite right in identifying the fact that even the first of the post-Second World War books on Pearl Harbor, on the Battle of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, are a narrative of the Great War at sea. And that definitely involves warships, leadership, admirals on each side, technologies and understanding of the technologies. So you could say that this naval history is kind of mired in time and has little new to offer. And so first of all, the challenge is to say what is new, what is different from the writing of it many years later. But it's worthwhile saying that going back to understand once again that original story and to put it in a new light and to say, well, it's not exactly true. When I do this study of the Battle of Midway, I'm going into a personal story which was not there before. I'm going into logic chains, and if you can show the logic chain in action. I'm going into the role of new technologies like decryption, so we have a general sense of where the Japanese fleets are coming, like the newer technologies of the war at sea, in the air or under the ocean. So we have a lot of new stuff to bring, but we have perhaps a way of looking at the war at sea in a more detailed, personal way, which was not there in the books of 50 or 60 years ago. But overall, we are looking at the struggles of navies against each other and at naval systems and naval air systems against each other. And I think we should just accept that. There's a lot of new stuff coming out, and the stuff could be either newer narrative stuff, Brendan, or it could be newer analytical stuff, or it could be newer, like Stop the War Now, Kennedy, this is chapter 7 of your book, and turn to chapter 8, and don't talk about fleet encounters anymore, but talk about an analysis of how the US industry and technology reforms itself at home to be able to produce all of the aircraft and aircraft carriers. And this is something new to be put into the story. So yes, there's old and there is new as well.
Yes, I was very struck when Steve and I were researching Midway at just how good actually some of the old accounts were.
Yes.
I mean, they were deficient in certain respects, which is why others, including ourselves, wrote additional books, but they were well researched and focused on many of the most important issues. It wasn't as if they were completely redundant. So a book by Walter Lord or Gordon Prang on Midway, even though 50 years old, can still be read with profit today. But Steve, how do you see this? I mean, in fact, your own background originally was in literature, and you came to history and to war, as it were, a bit later. Do you think there's a social and cultural dimension to Midway as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to take this. I mean, I think one thing that could be said is I think we, as I could say, as an American, as a Westerner. I mean, I've been living in England for like 12 years now, and I just seen that we believe a bit less in what we stand for and who we are. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I read Churchill's history of the Second World War is how he opens with the moral of the work And you can tell he's describing a war that he feels like it was important to fight, and there was a lot sacrificed, but it was a worthy cause. And yeah, I think there is this sense in which we're confused, like what is and I'm speaking to myself here in a way, where is the worthy cause? Do we have a worthy cause? And so I think there is that sense definitely coming through in the literature. I mean, and you get that a bit with Midway, and at the turn of the millennium in 2005, you get Shattered Sword by Parshall and Tully, which is much more about the battle from the Japanese perspective, but it describes the battle as a battle that was lost, that the Japanese really could have won, but they made a lot of mistakes. And so they lost the battle. And also with Alvin Kernan's Unknown Battle of Midway, he was there in the battle, and he writes this book where he sort of talks about all the failures with the torpedo bombers and these torpedo bombers, which essentially never had a chance. And they sent these guys out there in these planes. And so there is a way in which the battle itself, the way we tell it, there are cynical ways of telling it, or at least just darker ways of telling the story. And I suppose that is kind of wrapped up in a larger kind of cultural moment that we're in. But then, you have new voices. So, I mean, Francis Pike, his recent book on Hirohito's War, it's the first one volume. I mean, it's long. It's a long book, but it's the first one volume look at the Japanese perspective in the war, an attempt to describe the Pacific War from the Japanese perspective. So that's like the first time we've got this in English, and I think there will be more in that vein, which is really important. And I think it's great for for historians to have more from that side and to incorporate new perspectives.
So I wonder, Brendan, if, given our own present uncertainties, which Steve describes, are not quite sure of our Western ideology and our Western culture and mission, we could go back to looking at that Second World War with the failure to get into the minds, to have a historical empathy, to see that on both sides, the Japanese as well as the American and the British and the Germans for that matter, there was a great, I sense Steve is right, a greater conviction that the war aims that you were fighting for were noble ones. The word noble is hardly used by anybody these days.
I agree.
Noble ones which you have to stand firm for. And a young man joining a Spitfire squadron in 1940, or a young man being sent out to the Pacific War, on either side is somebody who lives in a culture where there is an identification of the inherent goodness and need to preserve the goodness of your own culture and way of life against the other side. And the Japanese certainly have the same vision, but will we have the historical empathy to get into the mindset of those who are taking part in this great conflict? I much doubt it sometimes.
Yes, I mean, this is something that we encountered in researching the book, because we actually interviewed two survivors, one of whom sadly has died. But they were both very young, 18-year-old at the time, one of them on the USS Hornet, one of the carriers, of course, at Midway, and the other, Bill Norberg, on the USS Enterprise. And in fact, we were able to meet Bill Norberg in person at the Navy Memorial 10 days ago or so, on the anniversary of the Battle of Midway. But it's sobering to think that, of course, he had served in that battle 80 years ago at the age of 18. It was very clear from what he was saying that patriotism was a large part of what was driving him. Now, we're very shortly out of time. I just have one last question, and it's for Paul. It's really to do with how you assess naval strength, because in the 1930s, a lot of people set pretty great store by the Italian Navy, and it would be easy to see why that was so, because of the quantity and indeed the quality of a lot of the equipment. And yet, for various reasons, some of them perhaps not obvious, the Italians underperformed quite seriously in the Second World War. And what I was wondering, Paul, was there any way of knowing that? before we went in? Is there some way that we can actually, somehow make better assessments of actual naval capacity? Because of course, if we could do that, it would make us more effective politically.
The story of the sad story of the Italian Navy, if you look at it as a whole, Brendan, is that Mussolini's Navy has some of the most magnificently designed, heavy, fast, new battleships of 15-inch gun battleships, heavy cruisers of admiral swerve and power. All of the Italian ships are faster than those of the British ships in the Mediterranean. It has a very large submarine force as well as a quite large destroyer force, and it's there positioned geopolitically to bestride the Mediterranean. So why does it not go better? And why do we not understand that? I'll shake my head sometimes rereading one of the learned articles in the background here who talk about how the British Admiralty right up until 1943 was estimating or overestimating the power of the Italian battle fleet. The Italian leadership is fearful. It's intimidated. The Italian Navy does not have a better decryption and intelligence decryption systems that the British have. It's not trained to fight at sea. It lacks an aircraft carrier and therefore is always intimidated even by a single British aircraft carrier. And it is not trained to fight at night, all of which going together gives certain advantages to the British that you wouldn't otherwise see by just looking at the daunting, intimidating Italian Navy from the outside.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank Paul and Steve very much indeed for coming on the panel. And of course, you, the audience, for attending and for your excellent questions. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do follow us on social media and check back on our website to stay updated with our work. The video recording for this event will be uploaded in a few days. Links to our website and to the YouTube channel are in the chat. Goodbye.